Maringo was a small town, peaceful and full of life. Simple mud brick houses stood in neat rows, surrounded by small gardens. The town's market bustled with women selling fresh vegetables, children running around, and men chatting under the shade of large mango trees. At the center of the town stood a white church with a wooden cross on top. It was the place where everyone gathered to pray, celebrate, and mourn. Today the town was quiet. Shops were closed, and the market was empty. Everyone had come to the church for Ama's funeral. Ama was a schoolteacher, loved by everyone in Maringo. She taught the children how to read and write, and she often helped adults with letters or important forms. People respected her because she was kind, smart, and always willing to lend a hand. When news spread that Ama had died, the whole town was shocked. It was hard to believe that someone so full of life could be gone. The people of Maringo gathered in the church to say goodbye. The small church was packed. Women sat in the front rows, wiping tears from their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men sat behind them, silent and serious. Children sat quietly on the laps of their mothers, not fully understanding what was happening. At the front of the church was a wooden casket surrounded by flowers. A photo of Ama stood on a small table nearby. She was smiling in the picture, and her smile made some people cry even more. Pastor John stood next to the casket. He was the leader of the church, and everyone respected him. He wore his long black robe and held a Bible in his hand. His voice was deep and steady as he began to speak. Ama was a light in this town, he said. She taught our children, helped our families, and showed kindness to everyone. Today we thank God for her life. The church was silent except for the soft crying of some women. Everyone listened closely to Pastor John. Then suddenly a loud bark broke the quiet. Woof! Woof! Heads turned toward the back of the church. There stood Simba, Ama's loyal dog. Simba was well known in Maringo. He was a big brown dog with bright eyes and a bushy tail. He was always by Ama's side, whether she was teaching at school, shopping at the market, or attending church. People loved Simba because he was smart and gentle. But today, Simba wasn't gentle. He stood stiffly at the church door, barking loudly. His eyes were fixed on the casket. "Why is Simba barking?" an old woman whispered. "Maybe he misses Ama," said another. Pastor John cleared his throat and continued. "Ama was more than a teacher. She was a sister to all of us. She..." "Woof! Woof!" Simba barked again, louder this time. Some children grabbed their mothers' skirts, frightened by the loud noise. People began to whisper. Dogs were known to sense things humans couldn't. Some believed dogs could feel danger or see spirits. Simba started walking toward the casket, his claws clicking against the wooden floor. His tail was stiff, and his barking grew louder. He scratched the floor near the casket, as though trying to dig through it. "What is wrong with that dog?" a man muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Pastor John wiped sweat from his forehead. He smiled nervously but kept his voice calm. "Let us focus on the service," he said. "Please ignore the dog." But Simba was hard to ignore. He barked and growled, his eyes never leaving the casket. His behavior made people uneasy. The women stopped crying, and the men sat straighter in their seats. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Pastor John seemed distracted. He looked at Simba, then at the casket, and then back at the crowd. His hands trembled slightly as he held the Bible. Finally, Simba let out a loud growl and scratched the floor again, his eyes burning with determination. He wasn't just barking, he was trying to tell them something. "Someone take that dog outside," Pastor John said, his voice louder now. A man stood to grab Simba, but the dog wouldn't leave. He backed away, barking even louder. The man hesitated, unsure what to do. The tension in the church grew. Some people whispered nervously, while others looked at Pastor John, noticing his pale face and shaky hands. Simba stood his ground, barking and growling at the casket. His behavior was strange, and everyone in the church felt it. Finally, a young man named Daniel stood up. Daniel stepped forward from the crowd. He was a quiet but curious young man who had always been drawn to puzzles and mysteries. Having recently returned to Maringo after years in the city, Daniel felt disconnected from the town's slow pace. But today, something about Simba's barking stirred his attention. The dog wasn't just barking randomly. He seemed to be focused, almost purposeful. Simba's sharp barks echoed in the quiet church, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was trying to tell them something. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Simba isn't barking for no reason. Maybe we should pay attention." People turned to look at him, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. "It's just a dog," Pastor John said, his voice louder than usual. He wiped sweat from his brow, his hand shaking slightly. "Dogs bark all the time. It means nothing. Let's not lose focus." But Simba barked again, louder this time, and scratched the floor near the casket. His growls were deep and insistent, as if warning them about something. "Dogs like Simba can sense things," whispered an old woman sitting near the front. "Things we can't see." "Don't start with those superstitions," Pastor John snapped, his smile stiff and unconvincing. "Amma was a good woman. This is just a noisy dog causing a distraction." Still, the crowd didn't seem convinced. Simba had been Amma's closest companion. The dog followed her everywhere. Simba's loyalty to Amma was well known, and his current behavior didn't feel normal. Daniel knelt down in front of Simba, holding out his hand carefully. "What is it, Simba? What are you trying to tell us?" he said softly. Simba stopped barking for a moment, meeting Daniel's eyes with an intense stare. Then, with a low growl, the dog turned his focus back to the casket. He barked again and scratched the floor with urgency. A ripple of nervous whispers ran through the church. "What if something's wrong?" asked a young man in the back. "Nonsense!" Pastor John's voice thundered, startling the crowd. "Amma is at peace. We must not let a dog's behavior ruin this sacred moment." But even as he spoke, his face grew pale, and his words seemed to lack the confidence people were used to hearing from him. The people exchanged uneasy glances. Simba barked again, moving closer to the casket, his claws scraping the floor. Daniel stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on Pastor John. "You seem nervous, Pastor," he said calmly. "Why is that?" Pastor John's lips tightened, and his eyes darted around the room. "I am not nervous," he said, laughing awkwardly. "It's just disrespectful to make a scene during a funeral. Let's get back to the service." But the tension in the church was impossible to ignore. The women stopped crying, and the men sat straighter in their seats, their faces filled with doubt. Even the children clung closer to their parents, sensing that something wasn't right. "What's the harm in checking?" said an old man near the back. "Simba has never acted this way before." "There's nothing to check," Pastor John said, his voice shaking. "We must not disturb Amma's rest." But as Pastor John spoke, Simba barked louder and scratched more furiously. His barking filled the air, making it impossible for anyone to focus on the pastor's words. Daniel took a step closer to the casket. He didn't touch it, but his eyes narrowed as he studied the situation. Simba's behavior wasn't just strange, it was alarming. "Simba knows something," Daniel said, his voice firm. "He's trying to tell us, and I think we should listen." Simba's barking echoed through the small church, sharp and unrelenting. The people of Maringo sat quietly, their eyes darting between the dog and Pastor John. Most of them didn't think much of the commotion. To them, Simba was just a dog missing his owner. Pastor John stood at the front, holding his Bible close to his chest. He smiled warmly, though his face glistened with sweat. "My friends," he said, his voice steady, "this is a moment to honor Amma's life. Let us not be distracted by a barking dog. Simba is just mourning, as we all are." The crowd nodded, comforted by his words. Pastor John was a man of wisdom and kindness, someone they had trusted for years. If he said there was nothing to worry about, then surely it was true. But not everyone felt the same. Daniel, standing near the back of the church, watched Pastor John closely. Something about the way the pastor kept wiping his forehead and gripping the Bible seemed off. The warmth in his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And then there was Simba. The dog wasn't just barking, he was warning them. His eyes were locked on the casket, his growls low and steady. "Let us return to the service," Pastor John continued, his voice calm. Simba barked again, louder this time. Daniel glanced around, expecting the crowd to share his unease. But the people of Maringo were focused on Pastor John, nodding in agreement with his words. "Poor dog," whispered an old woman sitting nearby. "He's lost without armor." "Yes," another woman murmured. "Simba is just grieving. We shouldn't pay him any mind." Daniel frowned. Didn't anyone else see how strange this was? Simba wasn't acting like a dog mourning his owner. He was acting like something wasn't right. Pastor John cleared his throat and smiled again, though his hand trembled slightly as he turned a page in his Bible. "Amma's death was peaceful," he said. "She went to sleep and never woke up. What a beautiful way to return to the Lord." Daniel couldn't stay silent anymore. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. "How exactly did Amma die, Pastor?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. The people turned to look at Daniel, confused by his boldness. Pastor John stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time. He looked at Daniel, and then at the crowd. "I already told you," he said, his voice still calm but slightly uneven. "Amma passed away peacefully in her bed. There is nothing more to it." "Are you sure about that?" Daniel asked, his tone steady. Pastor John's hands gripped the Bible tighter. "Of course, I'm sure," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "I don't know," Daniel replied, glancing at Simba. The dog growled again, scratching at the floor near the casket. "It just seems strange." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "Nonsense," Pastor John said firmly. "I personally found Amma in her bed, resting peacefully. What more do you want to know? Let us not turn this sacred moment into a spectacle." Daniel studied Pastor John's face. The sweat, the trembling hands, the uneven tone in his voice, it all pointed to one thing: the pastor was hiding something. "Simba doesn't think Amma's death was peaceful," Daniel said, his voice calm but clear. Pastor John's face turned pale. "You are being disrespectful," he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "This is not the time for questions or doubts. Amma is gone, and we must pray for her soul." Daniel didn't back down. "If her death was truly peaceful, why are you so nervous?" Pastor John took a step back, his knuckles white as he clutched the Bible. "I am not nervous," he shouted. "I am simply upset that you are trying to ruin this moment of prayer and respect for Amma." The people exchanged glances but didn't speak up. Most of them still believed Pastor John. He had always been a man of trust and faith. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He looked at Simba, who was now pacing in front of the casket, his barks sharp and insistent. Whatever the dog sensed, Daniel could feel it too. Something wasn't right. "Simba knows," Daniel said quietly. Pastor John's eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of fear crossed his face. But he quickly masked it with a smile. "Enough of this," he said firmly, though his voice was trembling. "Let us return to the service." The funeral ended quietly. The people of Maringo slowly left the church, returning to their homes, still mourning the loss of Amma. Pastor John remained near the casket, speaking softly with a few people before stepping away. Daniel noticed how quickly he left the church, not waiting to console the grieving family or friends as he usually would. Simba, however, didn't leave. The dog stayed by the casket for a while, growling softly. When the last of the mourners had left, Simba turned to Daniel, barking once before running toward the door. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, following him. Simba barked again and sprinted down the dusty road, his tail stiff and his ears alert. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but decided to follow the dog. Something about Simba's urgency felt important. The road was quiet, lined with houses where people were sitting outside, talking in low voices. The sun was beginning to set. Simba led Daniel out of the main part of Maringo toward the edge of the town where Amma's small home stood. Amma's house was simple, a single-room building made of mud bricks with a thatched roof. A small garden surrounded it, though the plants were overgrown and untidy, as if no one had cared for them in days. Simba stopped at the front door, barking again. Daniel approached cautiously, feeling a strange tension in the air. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the evening breeze. "Why is the door open?" Daniel muttered to himself. He stepped inside, Simba close behind. The room was dimly lit by the fading sunlight streaming through a small window. Everything looked off. Amma's usually tidy home was in disarray. A chair lay overturned in the corner, and papers were scattered across the small wooden table where she used to mark her students' work. A broken cup lay on the floor near the bed. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "What happened here?" he whispered, his eyes scanning the room. Simba sniffed around the room, his nose brushing against the papers on the table and the floor. He barked once, then moved toward a small wooden drawer near the bed. "What's there, boy?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside the dog. He opened the drawer and began searching through its contents. At first, there was nothing unusual, just a few notebooks and pens, the kind Amma always kept. Then his hand touched something hidden beneath the notebooks. It was a small, leather-bound diary. Daniel pulled it out, brushing off the dust. The cover was plain, but inside the pages were filled with Amma's neat handwriting. As he flipped through, he realized it wasn't an ordinary journal. Amma had been taking notes about something she had discovered. One entry caught his eye. "I don't trust Pastor John anymore. There's something wrong with how he's handling the church money. The donations don't add up. Where is the money going? I need to find out the truth." Daniel felt his stomach twist. Pastor John, the man everyone trusted. Why would Amma write something like this? He read further. "I found a ledger hidden in the back room of the church. It shows withdrawals from the donation box, large amounts, and they don't match what's reported to the congregation. I confronted him about it, but he dismissed me, saying I was mistaken. I know he's hiding something." Daniel's heart raced. Amma had discovered Pastor John's secret. Was this why she... No. He shook his head, unwilling to believe that someone would hurt her to keep her silent. But the thought lingered. Simba barked again, pulling Daniel out of his thoughts. The dog was at the back door now, his paws digging furiously into the dirt of the garden. "What are you doing, Simba?" Daniel asked, stepping outside. Simba didn't stop. He dug deeper, dirt flying in all directions, his growling low and determined. Daniel knelt down beside him, brushing away some of the soil. His fingers touched something cold and hard. "What's this?" he murmured, pulling it out of the ground. It was a small metal box, covered in dirt but still intact. Daniel opened it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, he found a few folded pieces of paper and a small brass key. The papers were old receipts, but they all had one thing in common. They showed large amounts of money being withdrawn from the church's donation account signed by Pastor John. Daniel stared at the evidence, his mind racing. Amma had been right. Pastor John had been stealing from the church. And now, this key. What does it open? Daniel wondered aloud, holding the key up to the fading sunlight. Simba barked once more, his tail wagging slightly as if to say, "We're getting closer." Daniel looked back toward the town, the diary and the key in his hands. Whatever Amma had uncovered, it was bigger than he had imagined, and he knew one thing for sure. He had to find out the truth. The moon shone brightly over Maringo, but the night felt darker than usual. Daniel moved quietly through the church, his flashlight in one hand and the brass key in the other. Simba walked beside him, his ears pricked and his nose to the ground. The faint scent of old wood and candle wax hung in the air. Daniel's heart raced as he approached the back of the church. "What are we looking for, boy?" he whispered. Simba barked softly, leading him toward a door at the rear. The door creaked open, revealing a small storage room filled with dusty hymn books and cleaning supplies. Daniel's flashlight swept across the room, but nothing seemed unusual. Still, Simba sniffed around, his tail wagging slightly as he scratched at a wooden panel near the far wall. Daniel knelt beside him. "What's here?" he asked. His hand brushed against the panel, and he realized it was loose. Carefully, he pulled it away, revealing a dark staircase leading underground. "A hidden staircase?" Daniel muttered. His pulse quickened. He had lived in Maringo most of his life, but he had never heard about this part of the church. Simba barked softly again, urging him forward. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the air grew colder as they descended. At the bottom, Daniel found a heavy wooden door with a rusted lock. He held up the brass key. "This has to be it," he whispered. The key fit perfectly, and with a loud click, the door swung open. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Stacks of cash were piled on a table in the center, along with ledgers and receipts. Daniel's flashlight revealed even more: boxes of coins, donation envelopes, and documents showing large amounts of money being withdrawn. "This must be the stolen money Amma wrote about," Daniel murmured, his stomach twisting. Simba growled low and moved to another door at the far end of the room. His barking grew louder, more urgent. Daniel followed quickly, his heart pounding. The door was smaller than the first and had no visible handle or lock. He pressed his ear to it, and his breath caught. He heard soft breathing, weak but steady. "Is someone in there?" he called out. A faint voice answered, hoarse and trembling. "Help, please." Daniel froze. He didn't recognize the voice, but it was clear someone was trapped inside. "I'm coming," he shouted, grabbing a crowbar from a nearby corner. He wedged it into the door's edge and pushed with all his strength. The wood groaned and cracked, and finally, the door swung open. Inside, a woman sat on the floor, her wrists and ankles bound with ropes. She looked up at Daniel, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyes, though tired, held a spark of life. Daniel crouched down quickly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. The woman blinked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Amma?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Amma? The Amma he had thought was dead. "You're Amma?" he asked, his hands already working to untie the ropes around her wrists. She nodded weakly, leaning against the wall for support. Who are you?" "My name is Daniel," he said, his voice steady. "I followed Simba here. He led me to you." Amma's eyes shifted to Simba, who was now wagging his tail and licking her face. A faint smile crossed her lips. "Simba, you saved me." Daniel helped her to her feet, though she was weak and unsteady. "What happened?" he asked. "How did you end up here?" Amma's voice trembled as she spoke. "Pastor John," she said, her words slow and labored. He didn't want anyone to know what I found. The money, the lies." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had suspected Pastor John was hiding something, but to lock Amma away, it was worse than he had imagined. "You're safe now," Daniel said firmly. "We need to get you out of here." Amma nodded, leaning on him for support as they began the climb back up the stairs. Simba stayed close, his eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting danger. When they reached the main hall of the church, Daniel stopped and looked at Amma. "I don't know you, but I've heard about you," he said. "Everyone in this town loves you. They think you're gone." Amma smiled faintly, though her eyes filled with sadness. "They all believed him, didn't they?" Daniel nodded. "They trust him, but not for long. Once they know the truth, everything will change." Amma's grip on his arm tightened. "Be careful," she whispered. "Father John won't let this go easily." Daniel met her gaze, his expression determined. "Neither will I." The early morning sun cast long shadows over Maringo as Daniel helped Amma settle into a safe corner of his small home. She sat on a woven mat, her body still weak from days of confinement. Simba lay beside her, his head resting on her lap as if guarding her. Daniel sat opposite her, a notebook open on the small wooden table between them. "Amma," he began softly. "The people of Maringo trust Pastor John. I need to know everything. They won't believe me without the full truth." Amma nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "Pastor John wasn't always like this," she began. "At first he was a good man, a real leader, but over time greed took hold of him. He started taking money from the church donations bit by bit. At first no one noticed, but then the amounts grew." She paused, her fingers stroking Simba's fur. "I didn't want to believe it," she continued, "but the ledgers didn't lie. I found records showing the donations didn't match what was reported. When I confronted him, he brushed me off and told me I was mistaken. Daniel leaned closer. And then, Amma's eyes darkened. I kept digging. I found more documents hidden in the back room of the church. They showed large withdrawals from the donation account, money meant for building repairs, school supplies, and food for the needy. It was all gone, and his signature was on everything. Her voice wavered. I told him I'd go to the townspeople if he didn't stop. That's when he turned dangerous. What did he do? Daniel asked, his fists clenching. He tricked me, Amma said. He asked me to meet him at the church one night, saying he wanted to explain. When I got there, he locked me in that room. He told me no one would ever find me. Daniel's chest tightened. Amma, I'm sorry you went through that, he said, his voice low. But now you're free, and we have the evidence to prove his crimes. We're going to make this right. Amma looked at him with a flicker of hope. Do you think the people will believe us? Daniel nodded firmly. They trust him, but they love you. When they see the money and the documents and hear your story, they'll know the truth. By midday, the people of Maringo were gathered at the church. Word had spread quickly that Daniel had something important to say. The crowd murmured with curiosity as Pastor John stood at the front, his usual confident smile on his face. What is this about, Daniel? Pastor John called out, his voice warm but firm. Why have you gathered everyone here? Daniel stepped forward, his hands steady as he held the small metal box from Amma's garden. Beside him, Simba stood tall, and behind him, Amma walked slowly into view. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Amma? An old woman cried. But we thought you were dead. Pastor John's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. This is wonderful news, he said, stepping toward Amma. I'm so glad you're alive, my child. But where have you been? Amma's eyes met his, her gaze steady. You know exactly where I've been, Pastor. The crowd fell silent. All eyes were on Pastor John, who now looked slightly pale. I don't understand, he said, his smile tightening. What are you suggesting? Daniel stepped forward, raising his voice so everyone could hear. Amma was locked in a hidden room beneath this church, by you, Pastor. A wave of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd. That's ridiculous, Pastor John shouted, his voice shaking slightly. Why would I do such a thing? To keep her quiet, Daniel said sharply. He opened the box and pulled out the documents and receipts. Amma found proof that you've been stealing from the church. These ledgers show every withdrawal, every stolen shilling. The townspeople gasped again, their trust in Pastor John beginning to crack. Pastor John's hands trembled, but he forced a laugh. These papers could belong to anyone. This doesn't prove anything. Daniel turned to Amma. Tell them what you told me. Amma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I found these papers in the church's back room. They prove that Pastor John has been taking money meant for the people of Maringo. When I confronted him, he locked me away to stop me from telling the truth. The crowd erupted in whispers and shouts, their shock turning to anger. Is this true? A man shouted. Pastor, tell us the truth, another demanded. Pastor John held up his hands, his face pale. You must believe me, he pleaded. These are lies. Amma is confused and Daniel is trying to ruin my reputation. Simba barked loudly, standing between Amma and Pastor John as if ready to defend her. Daniel held up one of the documents. This paper has your signature, Pastor. Explain that. Pastor John opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sweat dripped down his face as the crowd closed in, their trust crumbling with every passing moment. The old woman who had cried out earlier stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. You told us Amma was dead. You told us she passed away peacefully in her sleep. But you lied, didn't you? Pastor John stumbled backward, his words tumbling out in a panic. I only did what I had to. The money. He stopped himself too late. The crowd gasped, their suspicions confirmed. You stole from us, a man growled. You locked her away to protect yourself, shouted another. Pastor John dropped to his knees, his hands trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said weakly. I needed the money. But it was too late. Daniel turned to the crowd, his voice steady. Pastor John betrayed our trust. Amma risked everything to uncover the truth, and we owe her our thanks." The people of Maringo nodded, their anger now focused on Pastor John. They moved toward him, their voices rising as they called for justice. Amma stood beside Daniel, leaning on him for support, her face pale but resolute. Simba barked fiercely, standing between Amma and Pastor John as if daring the pastor to make a move. Pastor John raised his hands defensively. "You must believe me," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm innocent. These accusations are lies meant to destroy me." Daniel stepped forward, holding the ledger he had found in the hidden room beneath the church. His voice was steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "This ledger proves otherwise, Pastor. It shows every withdrawal you made from the church's donation account. Money that was meant for the people of Maringo." He flipped through the pages, reading aloud the amounts written in Pastor John's handwriting. These funds were supposed to go toward repairing the church roof, buying books for the school, and helping the poor. But the money is gone. Where did it go? Pastor John stammered, sweat dripping down his face. I don't know what you're talking about. Those records, those could be fake." Simba barked sharply, cutting through his words. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs growing louder. "Enough of your lies!" shouted an old woman. "We trusted you, Pastor." Pastor John's eyes darted to the open church doors, and in an instant he made his move. He turned and bolted toward the exit, his robes fluttering as he ran. "Stop him!" Daniel shouted. Simba was faster. The dog lunged forward, blocking the pastor's path and barking loudly. Pastor John stumbled, trying to sidestep, but Simba growled, his teeth bared. The villagers quickly closed in, surrounding Pastor John before he could escape. "Where do you think you're going?" demanded one of the men, grabbing Pastor John's arm. "There's no running from the truth now," said another. Pastor John fell to his knees, his hands shaking. His eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy, but all he found were angry faces. Daniel stepped forward, holding up another piece of paper from the hidden room. "This isn't just about the stolen money," he said firmly. "We found evidence that you threatened Amma to keep her quiet. You wrote letters warning her to stay silent or face the consequences." Amma nodded, her voice trembling but clear. "You locked me away because I wouldn't stop asking questions. You said no one would believe me if I told them the truth." Pastor John's shoulders slumped. He seemed to realize there was no escaping this time. I didn't want it to go this far." "Why, Pastor?" an old woman cried, tears streaming down her face. "We trusted you. You were supposed to guide us, not steal from us." Pastor John looked down at the ground, his voice shaking as he finally confessed. "I was afraid," he said. "Amma found out everything, about the money, about my lies. She threatened to expose me. I didn't know what to do." "So you locked her away?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with anger. Pastor John nodded slowly. "I thought, if I kept her quiet, no one would ever know. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to protect myself." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "Protect yourself? By stealing from us? You betrayed us, Pastor." Daniel raised his hands, calming the crowd. "Let's not take justice into our own hands," he said firmly. "We'll let the authorities handle him." The villagers agreed, their anger now tempered with disappointment. Two men stepped forward, taking Pastor John by the arms and leading him toward the door. Simba barked once more, standing tall beside Amma, as if declaring victory. As the crowd began to disperse, Amma looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for helping me." Daniel smiled. "You were the brave one, Amma. All I did was listen to Simba." Amma chuckled weakly, leaning down to pat the dog's head. "He's the real hero," she said. The two of them watched as Pastor John was taken away, his once proud figure now slumped in shame. The truth was out, and though the betrayal stung deeply, the people of Maringo began to feel a sense of hope. Justice had been served, and with Daniel, Amma, and Simba leading the way, the town would begin to heal. The morning air in Maringo was crisp and fresh, filled with the promise of change. The once faded church now stood as a beacon of hope. Under new leadership, its doors were open wide, welcoming everyone with warmth and sincerity. The new pastor, A soft-spoken but deeply respected woman named Mama Grace had already begun rebuilding trust in the community. She was known for her honesty and her tireless work to restore the church's role as a place of unity and support. Under her guidance, the stolen funds were being recovered, and projects that had been abandoned under Pastor John were finally moving forward. The townspeople gathered every weekend to help repair the church's roof and repaint its walls. Amma, though still recovering, often sat in the shade with Simba by her side, helping organize the work. She had regained her strength bit by bit and was now preparing to return to teaching. Daniel stayed close, helping wherever he could. His steady presence and practical ideas quickly earned him the admiration of the townspeople. He helped establish a new system for managing donations, ensuring complete transparency. Each week, he and Mama Grace presented the accounts to the congregation, earning their trust, one step at a time. But Daniel found his greatest joy in spending time with Amma. They had grown close since that fateful night at the church. Their shared experiences created a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. One sunny afternoon, as they sat outside Amma's house under the shade of a mango tree, Simba stretched lazily at their feet, enjoying the quiet. Daniel handed Amma a small basket of books he had brought from the city. "These might help your students," he said, his voice warm. "I thought you'd like them." Amma smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you, Daniel. You've done so much already." He shrugged. "You've been through so much. This town wouldn't be the same without you, Amma. You bring people together." She looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You and Simba saved my life." Daniel chuckled, scratching Simba's head. "He's the real hero. But I'm glad I was there." Amma's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her voice soft. "I'm glad you stayed." The quiet between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken feelings that both were beginning to understand. Simba had become a celebrated figure in Maringo. Children adored him, often running up to pet him whenever he passed by. The elders told stories about his bravery, how his barking had uncovered the truth and saved Amma's life. The villagers even painted a mural on one wall of the church, depicting Simba standing tall beside Daniel and Amma. It was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and the strength of the community. Simba, for his part, took all the attention in stride, wagging his tail and basking in the affection of the townspeople, but his favorite place remained at Amma's side, ever watchful and protective. Months passed, and the wounds left by Pastor John's betrayal began to heal. The church was thriving again, and the people of Maringo had regained their faith in one another. Daniel found himself spending more and more time with Amma. They worked together on community projects, laughed over shared stories, and leaned on each other in quiet moments. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel and Amma walked together along the edge of the town. Simba trotted ahead, sniffing at the ground and barking at the occasional bird. Daniel stopped and looked at Amma, his heart full. "Amma," he said softly, "this town brought us together, and I don't think I ever want to leave it, or you." Amma turned to him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I don't want you to leave either," she said. "You've made this town, and my life, better in ways I never thought possible." They stood there in the fading light, their feelings clear in the silence between them. Then, without another word, Daniel took her hand, and Amma smiled. Simba barked joyfully as if giving his approval and ran circles around them, his tail wagging furiously. Maringo was no longer just a town recovering from betrayal. It had become a place of renewal, hope, and love. The church stood tall, its doors open to all. Amma returned to her classroom, teaching the children with a joy that inspired the whole community. Daniel stayed, helping where he was needed, always at Amma's side. Their bond grew stronger each day, and the people of Maringo often whispered about the happiness they brought each other. As for Simba, he remained the town's beloved hero, always watching, always protecting, and always reminding everyone of the courage it took to stand for the truth.